Good evening, and welcome to the February 2015 edition of League of Women Voters Presents. My name's Randy Picht. I'm the Executive Director of the Donald W. Reynolds Journalism Institute, and I'll be your host tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about media ownership. Who owns the newspaper or the TV station you watch, the newspaper you read, or the website you look at in your local community, and how who owns the nature of that is changing, along with many other things in the media industries. We'll be focusing on the news industry tonight with our panel. You know, there's been a tremendous amount of change in the news industry in general, and media ownership is certainly part of that. I think you have celebrity buyers of newspapers like Warren Buffett and Jeff Bezos. You have venture capitalists and investment bankers buying newspapers because they think they're a good investment. You also have philanthropic organizations getting involved and nonprofit news organizations popping up. So there's actually a lot of activity right now in the ownership space. And I think each one of the panelists probably could talk about this subject for hours on end. So I'll have to try to be a good moderator and make sure that everybody just speaks the proper amount of time, probably starting with me. So I've already probably talked too much. So let me introduce the panel. So to my left is Andy Waters. He's the general manager of the Columbia Tribune here in Columbia, and third generation owner of the paper. Next to him is Mike Jenner, professor at the Missouri School of Journalism and holder of the Houston Harte Endowed Chair of Journalism, which focuses on innovation. And next to him is Mark Gordon, who is president and CEO of the Missouri Broadcasters Association. So let's get started. So Mike, perhaps you can give us kind of an overview of how things are changing in the newspaper industry in terms of ownership.
Sure, I'd be happy to. Well, over the course of history, we saw a lot of locally owned, individual family-owned newspapers in our country, and in the 20th century, we saw kind of a lot of publicly traded companies getting more involved in buying up properties around the country. You see the growth of Gannett Corporation and Times Mirror, Tribune Company, Knight Ridder, all those corporations, publicly traded corporations who saw newspapers as good investments. And that was, back in a time when newspapers were oftentimes the monopoly property in their community, and they were the kind of the prime news supplier, but also had a very strong franchise in the advertising area. So they were very profitable, and so you saw a lot of acquisition of those newspapers, especially in metro markets. Well, in the last 7 years, we've seen a lot of the air go out of the tires in terms of advertising revenue. The internet finally has come to really take away a lot of that advertising revenue, especially in metro markets. And a lot of these newspaper chains, as we call them, the publicly traded companies, to buy a lot of these properties, they went into a lot of debt, and so they're carrying a lot of debt, and now they're not valued, and the analysts and the stock market haven't valued them as much or as highly. So they've been in a kind of they've been doing a lot of cutting of expenses, but that's really not enough to sort of sustain all of their, to service their debt and to keep their shareholders happy. So we've seen a lot of effort by them to sell off some of these properties. And you've seen people like Jeff Bezos and John Henry in Boston buying the Boston Globe. Jeff Bezos, of course, bought the Washington Post. Warren Buffett, who is a value investor from way back, out of Nebraska, who has bought a number of properties too. So there's been you call them celebrity investors or celebrity publishers, but I think that they believe in newspapers. I think they also see value there in the real estate, if not in the actual value of the franchise. But I think they all see an upside and possibilities there as newspapers go through this transition. So right now there are about 25% of the newspapers in America, the daily papers in America, are owned by publicly traded corporations, and about a little less than 60% are owned by privately held groups, and there are about 20% of the papers in the country are owned by, of the daily papers, are owned by individual family, one property owners, independent owners, and they're not part of groups. So that number is actually a little misleading because there are some families that own multiple properties, but that's sort of the way it breaks down. In the weekly newspaper market, there are about 7,500 weekly newspapers in the country,
And how many daily papers?
I'm sorry, there are about 1,350 daily papers. And of course that, things are changing a little bit there because some papers that once published a print product 7 days a week have now reduced the frequency. So we're seeing a little bit more of that. But, it's, the numbers are a little higher in the weekly market and the weekly industry in terms of individual family owners. But there still is a lot of group ownership of weeklies as well. So I think that there are the people who are buying these properties, like Bezos and Buffett, they see value there in the newspapers, and they recognize that they all speak to the value of the newspaper to society and to democracy, as well as, I think, value as an investor. So I think that's good. I think that's great that they're investing in that, and I think that we'll probably continue to see that kind of activity going on.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered that question or not.
Yes, you did. That's a great overview. And so, Mark, what's going on with TV and radio stations? It's a little bit different, right?
It is, and it all starts with the fact that we are highly regulated by the government. So there's only so many things that radio and television stations can do when it comes to ownership. The radio stations went through consolidation a number of years ago, and so they have the ability, an owner has the ability in a specific market to own, I think up to 4 FMs and 4 AMs they can own maximum in the market they're in. Television has always been the situation where you could only own one television station, and then that changed a few years ago where big market television stations could purchase a second station as long as it was not in the top 4 or the top 4 network affiliations. So, for example, but only in large markets. So in St. Louis and Kansas City, for example, Kansas City is a good example, they have a situation where the Fox affiliate, or the NBC affiliate rather, owns a station. The CBS affiliate owns a second station. And then in St. Louis, you have a situation where the Tribune company owns the Fox and the CW. So they can own those stations. They can't own, an NBC can't own a CBS and so on. So then in 1999, there was a change in a situation where you could have what they call a shared services agreement and a joint sales agreement. And what basically happened is that you had sidecar companies. So you had you could go into, and we have several of those. We have 4 of those in the state of Missouri, and 2 of them are in Springfield, and 2 of them are in Joplin. And so basically, what happens is you have a primary owner, and they own one of the affiliates, and then they have a secondary company that they don't have, that they don't own, that owns the second affiliate, but they don't control. They are paid by the first company to operate their sales departments and operate their news departments and production and promotions and things like that. So that is occurring in many markets.
So is that relatively new?
1999 is when it started. It was approved. They had to, the folks that came up with this idea had to go to the Justice Department to make sure, because, like I say, you're limited in what you can do. There's also limitations on how many, what percent of the population you could actually own across the country in TV households. And I believe the percentage is capped at 29%. So no one company can own more stations that represent more than 29% of the total of the country. So you have CBS and NBC and ABC and Disney and Fox. They own many stations around the country, but they're limited. They can't go into other markets because Fox in particular is very close to the cap. But so they own some stations, and usually they own them in the New Yorks and the Los Angeles and the Chicagos and places like that. And then now you're beginning to have other companies. The next largest company is a company called Sinclair Broadcasting. And in fact, they own, they're in 4 markets in Missouri. And so they have reached that cap. And the cap was originally set up, there were really 2 caps. It was a percentage before the digital conversion. VHF stations had a greater value than UHF stations.
Right.
And so what would happen was companies like Sinclair bought up more UHF stations because there was a 50% discount in that ownership cap. Does that
Right.
make sense?
Yes.
Okay. So now with the digital conversion, what they've found is that the UHF stations actually are susceptible to less interference and seem to have more value. So now there hasn't been a ruling yet from the FCC, but there's going to be where they will cut that off, and they're not authorizing any more sales that go into that. So they've basically said, we're not going to let you to go past that cap and use that UHF discount. So what's happened is we go back to these JSA and SSAs, the Joint Sales Agreement, Shared Services Agreement. So these sidecar companies are told to have, they usually have 2 or 3 employees in the building, and then all the other employees that run both stations work for one company. So you have, in the case of many of them, what you have is you usually have a chief engineer that works for the sidecar company, and then you have a business manager, and generally speaking, those are a program director. The one area that is supposed to keep separate from the 2 companies is programming, but the area that's not is news. So the main company, or the company that has most of the employees, can run the news department for 2 stations. But it seems to be happening in these smaller, medium and small markets. So what that has caused is a situation where there's been a lot more of these arrangements being made, and a lot more of them occurring, so that has created a situation where there's a lot more activity from the purchasing of stations in the country for TV. Radio's kind of quiet. There are some sales going on. There's some consolidation. There's some mergers that are occurring. But the reality is the bulk of the transactions tend to be happening on the TV side of things.
And I think here, did that happen in Columbia with KMIZ and?
No. KMIZ, interestingly enough, the Fox affiliate that they manage, they get to own because that affiliate is a low power.
Oh.
Okay. So that's not under these rules.
Okay.
You see, and the My Network is on their digital tier, which you can do.
Okay.
So that's not in this mix.
So
all right?
Okay. Well, so they can take advantage of various ways to sort of have joint ownership or dual ownership, whatever you want.
However, the cloud arose in our industry last year. The FCC came in and said that they would not authorize any more JSAs, joint sales agreements, unless they can show that the sidecar company sells more, a higher percentage. The dominant company that in the building could only sell 15% of the advertising revenue. And so now what's going to happen is that within 2 years, these joint sales agreements are going to have to be unwound. And those will be unwound. So that's created a situation where there's a little bit of uncertainty in the industry right now. And are they going to be allowed to purchase more or not?
Huh.
So,
Okay. Good.
more than you asked for.
No,
You got it.
that's all right. Okay, Andy.
I thought the newspaper industry was complex. I had no idea.
I'm taking up half your show.
So Third generation ownership. Can you just talk a little bit about the kind of the pros and cons of being of owning a newspaper as a family, and maybe how some of that is changing now as we get more into digital kind of communication?
Well, the thing that's changing is I used to want to be a metro paper. I used to want to be bigger than I am now. And now I don't want anything to do with metro markets, and they're the ones that are having all the trouble. The
Right.
community papers, the smaller markets like we are faring much better than the large metro papers, and so I'm glad to be the size that we are. The main advantage that we have in the structure that we have, and really is the connection that we have with the community. It's really hard, if not impossible, for a big chain operation to have the same kind of relationship with the community that an independent, family-owned newspaper does. Our ownership, all our top managers live right here in Columbia. All the decisions are being made in Columbia. We live or die based on what happens in our community. So we're, completely vested here. We're not controlled by some entity somewhere else that doesn't really care what happens in Columbia. And that's just, what happens when you have ownership that's in some far-flung place, in corporate headquarters somewhere in another state. And that really matters. It matters in the type of commitment we have to news coverage. It's a little bit of it's a lot different when it comes to when decisions are being made, for financial reasons, and in another part of the world, you just don't have the same commitment to upholding standards in the newsroom because it's expensive. We've always in Columbia, kind of taken pride in, but really been willing to spend more money in our newsroom than what you might see at other newspapers across the country that are really beholden to a certain profit margin. And that's not to say that we don't try to be profitable, because if we weren't, we wouldn't be in business, and we would have none of the the coverage that we have now. But we're willing to spend more to maintain that quality, and I think that comes with family ownership. There are
and the continuity, probably, as you're all talking about what to do and plans and stuff like that. You don't have people dropping in out of the sky.
Well, that, and there's if you talk to somebody who works at a publicly traded company, really of any kind, it doesn't have to be in the newspaper industry, but certainly the newspaper industry is susceptible to this, and any media company. When you're publicly traded and your financial results come out every quarter, and a lot of times the management bonuses are based on those financial results, you necessarily are going to have a short-term perspective. And that's something that we just flat out don't have to worry about.
Right.
And so we get to have a long-term perspective. My perspective is decades. And the decisions I make, maybe people think are crazy, but I expect that they might bear fruit, a generation from now. I'm talking about, how can we get young people involved in the news in some way? And some of these initiatives are, complex, difficult. It takes money, but they're important. And I think to get the next generation of people interested in, not just our news, but any news. It's important for the community. It's important for democracy, like Mike said. Mm-hmm. So that's definitely a difference in perspective that comes with family ownership. And there are some economies of scale that that large companies have that we don't, and there's purchasing power that may come with multiple properties, and you can consolidate back in services and certain departments. But a lot of big companies can kind of take that advantage and go too far with it. Also, they start consolidating things like customer service, or they consolidate the copy desk. I don't know how that works, because we a lot of the flavor of the newspaper and the credibility we have comes from having a news staff that knows the community. And if, the folks that are editing the paper and laying it out and writing the headlines don't live here and don't really understand the difference between Broadway and Broadway Street, then you're gonna see that in the paper, and people are gonna know that something's not quite right. And
Sure. Yeah.
so that's that may be an abuse of that economy of scale. But on the balance, of course, I think it's a fabulous thing that we have independent family ownership here, and really it makes a big difference, and I think it's served us well over the years.
Yeah, great. So, Mike, let me ask you, kind of building on what Andy said, you've worked for family ownership paper and a publicly traded paper, and so can you maybe talk a little bit about what the difference is? I mean, one thing is maybe you weren't asked to manage decades ahead, but long-term was what, a quarter or?
Well, in the publicly traded companies, maybe, but the family, as Andy said, I would echo a lot of what he said. It's, when you are trying to be innovative or do kind of change as you need to serve the needs of your audience or your customers, it's so nice to be able to walk down the hall and get an answer, as opposed to waiting for that answer to come back from Los Angeles or to get an edict that comes in from across the country, and then have to try to figure out how to implement the template that somebody really smart guys in LA or Sacramento or wherever came up with that maybe doesn't fit in New England. So that's one advantage of local family ownership. I do think that Andy kind of hit the nail on the head when you're in the grocery store and you run into many times when I was in Bakersfield, I'd be buying some milk or whatever, and somebody tackle me in the checkout line about our coverage or what the editorial was about and who we endorsed for president. And that's there's a penalty you pay if you're trying to get out of the store. But I think there's value in kind of being in the community. I think that there's some pride of ownership, but there's also a feeling that you've got an obligation, and you want to meet that obligation, and you want to serve your community and do the right thing. So I think there's a lot of upsides to independence, and really I think there's a lot of value to family ownership as well. Now I have to say there are I've seen some I know of some family owned newspapers and some locally independent newspapers that have made bad decisions or haven't been very well run, but I think by and large the pressure's on there to kind of live up to a standard and expectations of your readers, and so I think that I think overall there's a lot to be said for being locally owned and being family owned. So.
And I guess that's for Mark, the same thing goes with terms of corporate ownership and templates coming down
Sure.
and news packages and that kind of stuff. Is that changing at all, or is it getting worse or better? I guess it depends where you sit with whether it's worse or better.
I think it's a mixed bag. I think you have some ownership groups that kind of have regional news directors that kind of have templates of what they've seen success, and yet they allow autonomy that does go on, so they're kind of as a guide. And then you have some that pretty much say this is what we think will make us money, so we all need to do this. And so it's a mixed bag. I've worked for both groups. I've worked for private ownership and I've worked for public, and there's tremendous pressure. It's very, very expensive to run a news operation anymore, and it's expensive in the newspaper business, I'm sure, and it's very expensive in the television business. And the consolidation is a two-edged sword when it comes to news, because there have been more newscasts than ever before that have been added to these stations, and these sidecar deals I just referred to, they wouldn't be able to afford to have another newscast. The management of that newscast is does become, two news stations are managed by one person. And so that does kind of have a difference in coverage sometimes, but at the same time they're financially driven have ratings, and they have to have ratings. They want to try to appease what they want to try to reach what the public wants. That, and then of course the competition is just massive anymore. It's massive for all of us. There's so many different sources where people get your entertainment and your news, and so that creates a situation where we're all trying to get into the digital world. You know, we know that's the future. Broadcasting knows that. I know newspaper knows that. There's a lot of pressure. How do you monetize? How do you get that? And that's much more challenging for small markets than it is for big.
Yeah, and I think the owners, you know, folks like to understand how the ownership impacts the newsroom. You know, there's the case of Rupert Murdoch buying the Wall Street Journal, and everybody, you know, this concern about what he was going to do to the Wall Street Journal. And I think Pew Research did a study, and they found that he had changed the Wall Street Journal, but nothing really nefarious. It was more, his vision was the Wall Street Journal should be more of a general interest newspaper. In fact, he famously wrote to Punch Schulzberger of the New York Times about how, you know, let the games begin, because he was saying, I'm going to take on the New York Times. And so that's what he's done. There's more entertainment stories. There's less business news. Now that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a different thing. And I think that's one of the things about the changes in ownership. It may not be necessarily bad. It's just going to bring a different focus or a different approach to how news organizations are run. Now, you haven't had to deal with that, but you certainly can see how people can change. And maybe, Mike, you know, with different editors come in and they want to do different things with the paper, it kind of can really change things, but it's not necessarily a bad thing.
That's correct. I mean, sometimes you get new ideas and new blood, and you'll see you know, some things that are very positive. But that's a little different, though, than I think, you know, if you're talking about the ownership. Generally, I mean, you want the ownership to kind of have a longer, you know, time horizon, and you know, you're not looking for kind of a change happening, you know, rather quickly. I mean, you rather see that sort of, you know, some constancy there.
Yeah, so, and Andy, I guess the idea here is that family ownership is working pretty well for the Columbia Tribune.
Yeah, it's working great, and you know, long may it live. You know, I think that you know, ideally, you know, it doesn't matter what the ownership is. You know, there should be the commitment to, you know, kind of hands off the news operation. But we all know that doesn't happen, and it's particularly hard with the corporations.
Right. Yeah, and there's always some issue in terms of that kind of who's going to influence, you know, what's actually being produced in the content or on air. So that's always going to be a challenge. And I think we just scratched the surface, but we're running out of time. So I want to thank all of you for participating in this, and thank you all for watching, and we'll see you next month.